Hello and welcome to Attapod, a podcast by the Australian Taxpayers Alliance. I'm your host, Emilio Garcia. Today, we talk to Paul Shetler about ethics in AI and the recent scandal involving a Chinese whistleblower in Australia. Please enjoy the episode, and don't forget to stick around after the episode to learn more about the ATA. Please enjoy. So here we are once again in the Australian Taxpayers Alliance office. We're here with Paul Shetler. Paul.
Hello.
Thank you so much for being here. So one of the topics I want to talk about today with you is the issue of ethics in AI.
Yeah.
So essentially the idea is when the processing power of computers gets advanced enough that they're actually going to be able to make decisions on behalf of humans that have human consequences, the developers are saying that they want to make sure that they're making decisions that are baked in with human perceptions of what's fair, good, and reasonable, right?
Yeah.
But you have a little bit of a perspective on this that I think a lot of people haven't heard before.
Okay.
So do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
I do have a bit of perspective on that. Yeah, so my big issue with ethics in AI is just the misuse of the word ethics. I mean, ethics implies that, you've actually done some study of moral philosophy, that you're grounding this in some kind of overall theory of the good,
Right.
and how that is supposed to work. And what I think, actually not what I think, is what I've seen in most cases, the people who sort of bang on about ethics in AI have no background in philosophy, have no sense of the good, but they do have a sense of politics, and they know that, to say something is ethical is a much more effective way of getting people to do something you want than to say, hey, this is something I'd like you to do. Will you do it for me, please?
Okay, so what you're saying is this isn't being put together by ethicists, by people?
Not really, no.
Oh.
If you usually look at these things, I mean, there might be people who have some, to be honest with you, very few, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, very, very few. So I'm quite familiar with a lot of these sort of ethics in AI things that are going on in government, also in private sector, and you would find very few people there who've actually studied ethics.
Gotcha.
Very few people, but you do find an awful lot of people who have a sort of very progressive political agenda,
Right.
Which they're dressing up with the word ethics because, they'll use words like fairness, they'll use words like equity,
Yes.
they use all these kind of words that are really fraught with sort of almost emotional meaning. As humans, we think we want things to be fair,
Sure.
but they never define what fair is. And so if you look at some of the recent guidelines that have come out, particularly the ones from the Department of Industry, really, they were really just very, I thought, frivolous.
Okay.
Because they were using these big words, but without any kind of definition of what they meant by them. Which means it's really kind of a loophole so big you could drive a busload of bureaucrats through it to try to enforce these things.
Right. So these words you're describing are, for example,
human. Human.
Wow.
So what we want a more human, human-centered AI. Like, okay, so what other kind of AI would there be since we're all humans here?
Right.
So by definition, what we're doing is human.
I saw a tweet of yours on that saying we want, based on human ethics, which is as opposed to
aliens, I don't know, sponges. I mean, really, honestly, who else is having these discussions, right?
Right, but maybe some other terms, and I'm not sure. I'm just speculating here. Something like, so this is just purely my speculation. But is this something along the lines of maybe safe? The word making people feel safe, which today has a lot of connotations.
It's the same kind of thing. Use the word safe because you really want to tell people to shut up. If you feel uncomfortable saying shut up, so you say, you make me feel unsafe.
Right. And this is what we saw on Twitter, I believe. And maybe this is a completely different ballgame, but essentially the whole shadow banning software that they put in place apparently involved words like American flag, guns.
Yeah, I think that's a slightly different question. But but it's really comes down to euphemisms, right? For me, I much prefer that people be direct and say what they really mean, rather than hide behind words which have, which can be interpreted any different way, but which sound nice. Like no one, like saying "be good." Okay, yeah, great. Google's saying "don't be evil."
Right.
Okay, great. Yeah, no. I woke up this morning. I was planning on being evil, but gee, Google, you convinced me not to. I mean, who does that, right? But it's a way of sort of dressing up what you're doing in very fancy clothing, but it's really nothing there.
So what are the implications of this essentially? Because if computing, when
I think there's
computing
big
reaches,
implications of it. I think the big implications of it are when these things start getting codified
sure,
as standards or things which you must do, and then they're enforced by HR departments. They're enforced by woke bureaucrats in government. They're not well defined. That means, like I said earlier, you can drive a busload of bureaucrats to these things. It means that they've built a whole scaffolding for a whole new set of regulation, which is not defined in advance,
sure,
and which will be defined after it's already there, and it's too
Right.
late to do anything about it. Which is why I'm demanding, or expecting that people should be clear about it.
Sure.
And I think everybody should expect that, because if they don't, they're going to wind up finding a whole truckload of regulation out there that they had no idea was even being planned.
Yeah, I got you. Well, I remember there was this was more on the left wing, but the right wing was kind of upset about it. This was in the States, that they came up with some kind of system, this program that could essentially look at people's backgrounds. You just fed it through the program, and it would determine whether or not they needed a longer or shorter sentence. And
this is basically for risk of recidivism.
Yeah,
So
that's it.
We had one of those when I was at the Ministry of Justice. Yeah.
Yeah.
We had basically a risk of serious recidivism calculator.
And they were some of them were upset about it. A lot of people on the left were kind of upset about this because they thought that it essentially disproportionately affected different racial groups, things like that. And they said that essentially what needed to happen is that it needed to be maybe injected with a little bit more humanity.
Yeah, well, basically, there's I like to talk about people creating artificial stupidity, like not noticing things. I mean, I think that's one of the big problems right now is that computers are throwing up the data at us, and they're throwing up patterns at us, and we've sort of been programmed almost not to notice these patterns.
Okay.
And we've sort of been programmed not to notice this data, but the computers haven't been programmed not to, and they do notice it. Right. And then we're sort of trying to figure out, well, what do we do about this? There was a recent case that was quite interesting where I think it was at Google, where they came out with some algorithms which they said, oh my gosh, this is really terrible. This discriminates against some group. I don't know which group it was.
Okay.
And so they came up with another algorithm which did not discriminate so much against that group, but also which was much less effective at doing what we're supposed to do.
I got you.
Right? And it's sort of like, we have to dumb these things down to make them socially acceptable. Because there's a lot of myths that we have in our heads that are just too precious to allow us to see reality for what it is.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so I suppose what you're saying essentially is we should have some kind of moral basis to these.
Of course.
Yeah. But they're just not doing it, right? So would you suggest?
Well,
having
I think the clearest thing is, first off, you operate from a position of truth.
Okay.
You operate from a position of truth. You don't operate from a position of lies. Lying is unethical. If you want to know what's ethical and what's not, the first thing is you tell the truth. And then what do you do with that truth? Well, then you figure out. Then you look at it. You look at the information. You look at the situation, and you decide what's the right thing to do in that situation. But I think if you start out from a position of lies, then you're never going to make an ethical decision.
So I'm going to play devil's advocate.
Yeah,
because I think I kind of understand some of the things that some people would get upset over, even though it's so with the case of the recidivism algorithm, saying
a lot of them are not that accurate. And the thing about the recidivism calculations are they could be a lot better than they are.
Sure,
they're not in fact terribly accurate.
Well, no,
we saw that in UK. I don't object to people saying, "Oh my God, these aren't great algorithms. They're not terribly predictive."
Right.
Because they're not.
Well, but let's say that they are good. They actually have a good predictive model, right? Okay. And you feed someone's case through the machine, and essentially it sees, well, this is a person who grew up in this neighborhood. They have a last name or a first name that kind of associates it to this group of people who have higher recidivism. There's more crime in this area. Thus, we're going to make the conclusion. We're going to push out the conclusion that, in fact, this person is higher risk, when maybe the individual himself isn't actually that high risk.
Right.
And so this is, and I'm just playing devil's advocate here. I'm saying I could see how some people would become upset.
Well, I can certainly see how some people would be upset with that too, because I think what you want to do is you want to be accurate with these things, right? You do not just sort of want to go out there and just, on the basis of a couple parameters, decide that somebody is, worthy or unworthy of what you're trying to do.
Mm.
The goal is to be accurate.
Sure.
The goal is to be telling the truth.
Mm.
The goal is not just to be, overly general. And I
Right.
think that's one of the problems with some of these recidivism calculators. I mean, there actually is a problem with some of them.
Sure.
We had that problem in the UK. I know because I was chief digital officer at the Ministry of Justice, and we
Right.
had these calculators, and they could have been a lot better. They're just not that good at predicting.
So how important, if you were to put things on a balance, what's more important? Kind of getting the team of ethicists to come in and really put the big brain morality into it, or is it more about just accuracy and proper learning?
I think it's both. I think you need to actually have the data. You actually have to have information that you can deal with that is real, and that is, if you're aware of a bias, to remove it. And by a bias, I don't mean something which says, X is more likely than Y,
Right.
because if X actually is more likely than Y, but I mean a bias that says X is more likely than Y when it's not.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, that's a quite clear bias, and that's kind of the statistical meaning of bias.
In your experience, is that relatively easy to detect?
Bias is not that difficult to detect. That's not actually. So you want to make sure that you have clear data sets,
Sure,
clean. But once you've got that, you still want to know you're doing the right thing. So suppose you come out with an algorithm that says, we have X% likelihood that if this person owes, let's say Robodebt. Let's just say Robodebt, right?
Okay.
And they came up with an algorithm that said, wow, 80% likely that this person's going to owe money or whatever, but 20% they're not, right? Now, is it ethical to then send out debt notices to everybody?
Oh, yeah.
Well, this is the problem. The government did that, right? So this is the issue, right? So, that's where the ethical decision comes in.
Sure.
You still have the information. Then you decide what you do with it. You still got a certain amount of error or not. It may have an impact on people's lives or not. That it probably, if you were going to make those decisions as a person, you'd probably go back and check a bit further.
Sure.
And they did none of those things.
Right. Okay. Well, I totally agree with you. Very little I disagree on there.
Awesome.
But let's move it away from the government and into the private sector, because I think those have very different implications. The government has different obligations to the population than corporations do.
Yeah.
So what happens, for example, when these types of programs can determine, for example, someone's health insurance premium, or how much someone should pay for their car insurance, or, for example, what their interest rate should be on a credit card, things like that. Could we see some issues in that regard?
I'm sure you probably could. I'm sure. In theory, I'm sure you could. Right? I think you can, in theory, see problems in almost any situation. The question is, do we see them?
Right.
And if you do, then what do you do about them? And if you're seeing a situation where I don't know, some individuals or some group or whatever, actually doesn't really matter how you classify people. I think if some group of people is being harmed by a decision which is wrong, which is for whatever reason not harming the company, so it's not harming their profits, then you might sort of wonder if there's some case for some kind of regulation or something like that in that particular situation.
Right.
I would tend to think that in a lot of those cases where companies are making wrong predictions, they're losing out on business. Right? Yeah. So someone else is going to take it, and ultimately it would harm them. Now, if we were really operating in a free market, that's what you would expect to see happen.
Right.
I sort of wonder, obviously the market isn't quite as free as we would like it to be.
Right.
It's pretty heavily dominated by monopolies, so you've got to take that with a grain of salt.
Yeah, sure. Okay, well, I think we've kind of reached the natural conclusion of this subject, so we'll move on to another issue, which we've been talking a lot about kind of privately, but it's obviously all over the news. And we essentially have a Chinese whistleblower, and he's telling us all the things that we kind of already knew, but now it's putting it into perspective. Now there's actual
And this is the one that the
information.
Chinese office in Shanghai is trying to claim, the police in Shanghai are trying to claim it's a gangster or something like that.
Yeah. No, and that there's no truth to it, and I mean, it's just that, well, whatever. I don't even know where to start. So essentially, where do we start? How about we start with the apparent plan to infiltrate the parliament?
I think it's very likely, isn't it? I mean, if you look at Chinese actions abroad,
Oh,
I mean, you've got to consider China is a country which is an emerging great power. It's the first country to challenge U.S. hegemony around the world since the end of the Cold War.
right.
That's a long time. And, at the time of the Cold War, both the United States and its NATO allies, as well as the Soviet Union, were going all over the place trying to affect each other's governments and to infiltrate this and infiltrate that. It would be shocking if the Chinese were not doing that now.
Of course.
It would be absolutely like, whoa, what's going on here? Are they no longer human? Right? I mean, that's what people do. So, I think it's quite... the only thing I'm surprised about has been the sort of weird reaction of, governments and parties to this news, the sort of denial. It's like, oh no, it's not really happening.
Right.
A lot of people have a very strong interest in strong commercial relations with China. And I think right now that's throwing it in high relief right now.
Yeah, of course. Well, as you say, I did, obviously it is very important, significant news. It's the first time that it's happened here in Australia that a spy at that level has decided to...
Yeah, it's big news.
I mean, it's big. But as you say, who's surprised?
Well,
it's impressive, but not surprising.
Yes, the funny thing is people are acting surprised. And the funny thing is also some people are sort of like, it's not really happening. There is a fair amount of denial, which I find shocking. Incredible.
I want to talk about something, and there's really not a lot of consensus currently, which is why I really want to talk about it now. The guy who apparently, the whistleblower says that there was one particular candidate that they were going to attempt to kind of run as a Manchurian candidate. He was a car salesman, I forget his name, and he ended up dead some months ago.
Well,
yes. This candidate...
Jeffrey Epstein did not kill himself.
Exactly, much like Jeffrey Epstein. But this is the candidate who was going to run in Gladys Liu's district, and she's now currently holding that seat. And we remember the controversy around Gladys Liu.
Yes.
I'm sure you remember.
Yeah,
right?
I remember some of that. Yeah.
I mean, ScoMo says that I'm a racist for asking questions. Am I?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I don't know enough about Gladys Liu because I just don't. I mean, I've heard stuff.
Okay.
I mean, look, I just think at this point, you have to assume that there's been extensive Chinese infiltration of politics and of business all the way across Australia, right? I mean, you look at the fact that 38% of our exports go there, according to Matt Berry. You look at the fact that, our education system is basically dependent upon Chinese students. The real estate boom is largely dependent upon Chinese investments.
That's right.
You've got, who buys our coal? Who buys the minerals? Who buys the... China is a primary customer for these things. So there's a huge amount of interplay, economic interplay, and people are going to be, the way people are and the way government is. There's a certain amount of corruption. There will be lots of shady dealings, all kinds of them.
Indeed.
And I'd be very surprised if there's only one person in Parliament.
Oh, me too. Absolutely.
I mean, given the very shady contributions they're making to Labor and others. I mean, come on. I mean, just like, suitcases full of money. I mean,
money has no political bias. That's certainly...
I mean, so it's happening, right? And it's been out there for a while. The news has been out there for a while. It's like, this is like a big story. But it's a big story in a context we already knew about for a while. But no one's done much about it, which is still what I find strange. No one's really doing much about it.
I think the story is a little bit more sexy because it talks about a spy and a covert operation and an attempt to infiltrate the government at the direct behest of the Chinese government. But we already see these types of collaboration. That's exactly what I was about to go to. Like, we have academia inviting in the murderous government of China. Just come teach our kids.
Absolutely.
And I think,
I mean, there's been a lot of compromises, in my view. A lot of compromises that Australian business and government have made in dealings with China, and no one can act surprised, in my view.
Well, the market is so big. I think China has really caught on to something that you can really get people and populations addicted to money really quickly. And they have just ample money just because they have such an ample market. You can even have a general population which is earning like dollar amount less than the developed world, and just because of the sheer volume of it, make it a day or night situation. This is a lot of what's happening in Hollywood, for example, that apparently movies that flop in the States are incredibly successful abroad, but more particularly and more relevant to what we're talking about, universities. The Chinese government can absolutely, with the stroke of a pen, divest essentially all of its students from one university or another. They have that type of authority. So is it not in Sydney Uni's interest to keep a Confucius Institute open?
Well, it might be in some financial interest.
Yes.
I think at some point they're going to have to make it. Look, I really believe that Australia's going to have to make a decision sooner rather than later. And it'll be kind of politically forced. Partially because already the Australian government is aligning with Trump, et cetera, in all this trade war stuff. So the Chinese are getting very finger wagging and saying, how dare you do these things? And that of course has another reaction. Australians have another reaction. When you scold somebody, there's two things that can happen. They can back down, or they can get their back up and they can say, what the fuck are you doing, right? And you're starting to see that happen now too, right? Good. So I think ultimately, and I think it probably won't take that long, it'll be much clearer, the situation with China. But right now it's still in my mind, a bit too murky for my liking.
It is murky to a certain degree, but I don't think anyone doubts more or less what China's intentions.
No, I don't mean that. I mean murky in terms of what we're going to do.
Oh, for
That's
sure.
What I mean. That's what I mean. I totally agree with you about China's intentions.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that some people bring up is that China itself is not a country that has a lot of unique traits to it in terms of what it can offer to the general global economy. So right now it's kind of built itself as a powerhouse for manufacturing, but it's not like any of like a large part of the resources are coming from the ground of China. It's not like they're offering wages that are unseen in other parts of the country, other parts of the world. So I'm wondering.
No, but the reason they're not offering wages, right? They're offering labor.
Right.
So labor is different than wages, right? The less wages you have, the more attractive your labor is, right? Because the lower the cost is. Right. I mean, that's what China did, right? They basically got all these Western companies to outsource and to basically just outsource everything to China. I mean, that's what happened to the Midwest. That's what happened to large parts of Great Britain. That's what happened to large parts of Europe. Companies just picked up and moved their supply chains to China. And it was a very weird thing. The governments even seemed to approve of it. Governments were sort of approving of their own deindustrialization and the building up of a very powerful rival. You sort of have to say, what the hell were they thinking?
Well, I think a couple of things. One, they thought that somehow the economic growth because of that would be so great that everyone would benefit from it. And another one is
it was like neoliberal globalist ideology. Oh wow, we have open borders and we're going to have everything free trade. It's going to be wonderful, and we're bringing them into the light of liberalism and all this and that.
That's it.
But it's like
they thought that suddenly China was going to turn into a liberal democracy just through sheer force of richness.
But also, it's like the general trend in the world is not towards liberal democracy. Not just China, right? Look at Hungary, look at Poland. A lot of countries are like saying, liberal democracy is interesting, but actually we're interested in something else. Something else. Liberal democracy, after World War II, very much identified sort of the U.S. system, right? And a lot of countries don't necessarily want to be part of the U.S. system. The problem with China right now is it's sort of forcing a binary choice.
Yes.
We'll see how that really plays out in the long term.
Sure. And just getting back to China really quickly and the point that I was making about what it can offer, my point is, what can companies not get elsewhere? Like, can we not get the same products and outsourcing and all this from India, other Asian countries, places in Africa? I mean, does China really have an advantage that is just so beyond the pale that
I think China does have some advantages. I think it does have some advantages. I mean, this is the thing, is so we can't just pretend it's going to be an easy situation because it won't be. I mean, definitely you can try picking up some of your supply chains and moving them other places. From China to Vietnam, for instance, let's say, or China to perhaps India. But you do have a pretty well-educated workforce in China. You got a pretty industrious workforce in China. You've also got the fact that you've got the Communist Party in charge there, so labor relations are going to be a piece of cake because no one's going to go on strike or anything else. So you've got a very subservient working class, and you've got a very qualified, I think, very industrious and very Yeah, very industrious working class there. So from that standpoint, it's difficult to move, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Also, frankly, it's that you can't. It's hard to sort of pick up one thing and move to somewhere else in a couple of months.
Oh,
it takes
sure.
a while to do that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I suppose the growth. I mean, there has been an impact on China, even just the U.S. impact. But you're right. Essentially, China isn't at risk of a populist leftist being elected and kind of throwing everything into disarray. There's a chance of that in a lot of places.
Yeah,
but not China.
I don't think so. But the interesting would be the spillover from Hong Kong, if anything. What I'm wondering about that, and it'll be really fascinating to watch because I have really no idea. But I would imagine. You got two major possibilities there. One is, this Hong Kong thing sort of spreads like a contagion in China, which I guess is one theory.
Sure.
And the other one is that there's sort of a reaction in China to Hong Kong. And you get the sort of upsurge of, oh my God, they're the enemy, and we're going to bully-side them. So I think that's going to be really fascinating to see.
Sure.
But it's weird, Xi is like really, the Chairman Xi, is really pushing sort of the role of the Communist Party in a way that his predecessors hadn't really done. And he really seems to be, I think, aware of the fact that China might have some problems without the regime might have some problems without a very strong and united Communist Party.
Sure.
And so I don't think he's going to be too willing to give ground.
Probably not.
I think that'll lead to an interesting situation.
Sure.
And we're going to have to be careful.
Absolutely. And speaking of Hong Kong, I think Australians might have been a lot more receptive to the information that this whistleblower gave us, considering what they're seeing in Hong Kong.
Sure.
Because we see these types of conflicts in a lot of countries, and it's hard for us to really put ourselves in the position of people that live in countries very different from ours, with a population very different from ours. But you look at Hong Kong, and that's just a normal westernized place, and to see it be cracked down on like that, I think really shakes up a lot of people living in places like Australia or like the U.S.
Yeah, it's got a lot of superficial westernization, that's for sure. What was fascinating to me about Hong Kong was recent elections, right? I mean, those numbers are really quite amazing. And to be honest with you, they surprised me. I didn't expect it to be that lopsided. I thought it'd be less lopsided than that. I was really amazed by that. That was quite something. Also, and one of the reasons I say that is because, listen, like for instance, the Singaporean PM. The Singaporean PM is saying, "Oh, well, actually, we could never tolerate anything like what's happening in Hong Kong and Singapore. We would never accept that. That would kill us as a country if we had riots in the streets and things like that." And he was kind of, pretty much taking China's side. So that was like, that's one of the reasons why I was like quite interested in, actually quite surprised by the sheer magnitude of the results in Hong Kong.
Are you hopeful for the situation in Hong Kong?
More so now than I was before, I think it's going to be harder when you've got this kind of numbers.
Yes, definitely.
To pull some major stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Paul, we seem to be arriving towards the end of the episode. So thank you so much for being here. Hopefully we'll have you on again soon.
Always a pleasure, mate.
Thanks so much. And to everyone, thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Attapod, a podcast by the Australian Taxpayers Alliance. If you care to know more about the ATA, visit their website, www.taxpayers.org, where you'll be able to see their mission statement, their projects, campaigns, objectives, and so much more. Remember, listening to the podcast is free, but creating it isn't. If you'd like to continue to see the Australian Taxpayers Alliance advocacy, please consider becoming a member or donating. You can do this on their website as well. This has been Attapod. We'll see you next time.